I acknowledge the first Australians on whose lands we meet and whose cultures we celebrate as the oldest continuing cultures in human history. Madam President, I'm sorry. I'm glad that's over. Speaker of the House, I'm not yet sorry. Prime Minister, thank you for honouring us with your presence. If I know something about the job, you've got a few other things on your plate today. To the Ministers of the Cabinet, thank you all for taking time out to be with us today. I have some idea of what you're wrestling with, including my boss, Penny Wong. To the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, I think I spied her a little while ago. Good to see you, Susan. Members of the Parliament, past and present, thank you as we gather together here in this citadel of Australian democracy. To my former colleagues, and I see so many of them here today, thank you for taking the time and making the effort to be with us here on this special occasion for Therese, myself and our family. To members of the public service who have worked with me over the years, and many of whom remain in harness, I admire your work, and what you do for the Commonwealth is of enduring importance. To members of my staff, past and present, all 4,602 of them, you can tell them because they're the ones who are exhibiting PTSD today. Some of them still are carrying wounds. Lovely to see you all, and there is a therapy tent for you over there for later on. But it's just so wonderful to have staff who become members of your family, and the multiple incarnations I've had in public life who come together for what is a family occasion, and the fact that so many of you are still part of our extended family. To Therese and to all of our family, my sister Lorraine, to Jess, to Nick, who can't be with us today, and also for Marcus and our two wonderful grandkids. Lovely to have you there, Mackie and Josie. To all of our friends. And if I could also specifically acknowledge Ambassador Carolyn Kennedy. You've been travelling recently, Carolyn, I've seen. Thank you for being America's representative here in Australia. You do your country proud. And we honour your dad on this most special of anniversaries, which you've just been attending in the Solomons. To our visitors from the United States Congress, welcome to the Australian citadel of democracy. You'll find it much less well-behaved than either the Senate or the House in the United States Congress. If you're going to question time today, just buckle up and get ready for it. Friends one and all. And of course Ralph Hymans, who has had to endure me as a subject. Think of the pain through which he has been in putting this together. It's a funny thing being asked to speak at an event like this. Like, I have done a lot of public speaking over the years. Most of you have had to endure it. But speaking at the unveiling of your prime ministerial portrait is the closest you come in life to being the after-dinner speaker at your own wake. But here goes. I mean, most of you think I can speak underwater. You're right. I'll give it my best. In fact, this event kind of almost nearly happened. For those of you who remember, it's nearly 10 years since I left the office of Prime Minister here in this country, and then sought political asylum in the United States. And either running a think tank, being an academic, and now most recently being appointed as your ambassador to the United States. So frankly, I've always pushed to one side the business of having this stuff done. In fact, the directors of the parliamentary collection here became so exasperated that they got to the point of threatening to organise anybody to do a knock-up job based on my official photograph. And if you've seen my official photograph, that's not something of which you'd be proud. And so vanity ultimately prevailed, and I decided to yield to having an official portrait done. In fact, the directors of the parliamentary collection said, a lot of people are complaining that you're this missing piece in the chronology of paintings of former prime ministers. and many of them think that you've gone the way of Harold Holt. You've either been taken by a Chinese submarine or taken by aliens. Where are you? And this actually is not an idle reflection, because when I was at the Asia Society, someone actually wrote me a note asking, where is your portrait? And on the front of the envelope, it was Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister of Australia, Area 51, Nevada, care of the Asia Society in New York. So that's how all this came about. As you know, we've done a few things in government in the period that we were in office. Some of them good, some of them contested, some of those things have endured, others less so. But I'm proud and honoured to have served as your country's 26th Prime Minister. As you know, in government, we didn't sit around and waste time. We did a lot. And I noticed those nodding who were part of the Cabinet and the government at the time. In fact, we were accused of doing too much, far too much. But you know something, in the full effluxion of time, I'd much rather, effluxion, by the way, Riley, is like programmatic specificity. It means passage of time. In the passage of time, I'd much rather be accused of having tried to do too much than too little. Because it is a precious opportunity you have as a government of the Commonwealth of Australia to achieve lasting reforms for the nation. I was always haunted by the words of P.J. Keating, and I know Paul can still have that haunting effect today. When I was just starting out in political life, I was a junior woodchuck then working for Premier Wayne Goss. And in Queensland, Paul was attending a Premier's conference with Bob. And Paul lost interest after about 20 minutes and was wandering around the Queensland Parliament building. And I noticed he was missing, so I thought I should chase after him and see what he was up to. He then proceeded to give one of those impeccable Pauline presentations on the purpose of politics, which began like this: Kevy, 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 he said, in politics, if you're going to go into politics, he said, mate, just don't waste time, hop into it. He said, a lot of people think that in politics it's like flying a Lancaster bomber. So it's slow and ambling over the target before eventually you deliver your ordnance. Mate, they can take you out before you even get to the target. Our job is to be a Spitfire. In, out, do your business and get it over and done with. Don't waste time. Classic Keating. So Paul has a lot to answer for in terms of the pace of activity in the government, which I was privileged to be Prime Minister of. Two or three quick reflections on not what we achieved, but on our nation's future. One is this. When I look at our democracy and this great chamber of democracy, which is our Parliament building, I say, as someone who's now lived in the United States for the last decade, I'm anxious for the future of all of our democracies. For those of us who assume that a democracy is the natural state of things, reflect for a moment on history. It was never thus. Our democracies were crafted by women and men out of much struggle and achieved only universal suffrage within the last century. And that's against 5,000 years of recorded human history. So this flower, this delicate flower we call democracy, is something to be nurtured, like a flower in the garden, because the raw, wild wilderness of raw politics can devour all in its wake unless we are careful. So for me in this place and in Australia, defending this great institution which we've inherited from the palaces of Westminster, that's fundamental. Defending the institutions which underpin the Parliament, including the independence of the public service, a robust institution to carry forward the institutional memory of our nation, the residual body of wisdom and intelligence to reflect on the challenges of today or tomorrow, is equally important. And to ensure that the people, when they vote for our members of Parliament, are mindful of and drawing on a free flow of unbiased information, where facts are separated from opinion, and where people can distill their own judgments about which course they want for the country's future. Nurturing all of that actively, not passively, is what we now must do, because the democratic project around the world is under threat, it's under challenge, and our global democratic project in so many countries is in regress, not progress. My second reflection, as I see the PM sitting before me today, is a sense of empathy for the vast nature of the great challenges which we now face together as a nation in the world. When I was Prime Minister, we had to deal with a global financial crisis, keeping the country out of recession. We had to deal simultaneously with an emerging climate change challenge. And then on top of that, implement reforms in health and education, industrial relations, in the aged care, the age pension, paid parental leave. This seemed really hard at the time, and it was, as we tried to do all of that in a limited frame of time. But when I look at what this government now has to wrestle with in this parliament against the huge structural challenges which we face, Prime Minister, you have the harder job than I did, and I mean that. One, we are in a region where the risk of crisis, conflict and war is real. Not a theory, it's a real threat. And this requires our democracies to navigate our security circumstances with a level of care, intention and foresight, and with hard decisions to be made. That requires acute management and leadership by our leaders here in this Parliament and in this government. Second, we have an accelerating climate crisis, extreme heat events, which are now life-threatening around the world. And third, if that wasn't enough, artificial intelligence, machines, machine autonomy over human beings, or human control over those machines. Artificial intelligence, a great force for good, or one which actually brings into deep challenge our ability to navigate our futures as free and individual members of the human family. And what are its consequences for our national security and our long-term national economic resilience? These are three enormous structural changes facing this democracy and all our democracies. So when I reflect upon the state of our debate here in Australia, and this is not a partisan reflection at all, it is simply with a degree of admiration and empathy that I observe the complexity of all of this and the urgency of it. These three great challenges which sweep across everything else, including what passes for our day-to-day political discourse in the normal business of day-to-day politics in our countries. And the final one is this, and that is, we often in positions of political leadership think that it's too hard. That is, that the challenges we face are too great. My experience, for what it's worth, is the great challenges we face as a nation often appear much greater in the anticipation than in the execution. Reaching the point of decision is hard because we're mindful of the risks. Sometimes afterwards, however, it is seen that that was just a decision we should have taken. When, for example, we were wrestling with the global financial crisis, they said we could never avoid a recession. We proved them wrong. When they said we could never secure for Australia a place at the world's top table, once again we proved them wrong and secured Australian membership of the G20. And when they said that the apology would be a problem for the nation, it would unleash this torrent of litigation from Indigenous communities across the country, that it would in fact set the process of reconciliation backwards, not forwards, we proved them wrong. In fact, what we did with the apology was actually bring the people of our country together, black and white, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal. And we began a process, a hard process for both sides of politics, of closing the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. So it is not my place to wade into the politics of this referendum. I'm now an ambassador on behalf of all of you in the United States of America. But I would simply reflect on this. Fears were raised 15 years ago about why we should not do this thing called the apology. other fears are being raised today. I would simply ask all Australians to reflect on the fundamentals about whether those fears are well-founded or not. The arc of history bends slowly towards justice. To conclude with some thank yous to the Prime Minister. Thanks, mate. You're a key member of my government. You did a bloody good job. And Minister for Infrastructure. Prime Minister and I have often discussed this, and the thousands of infrastructure projects for which he was responsible. Not one was the generator of a single item of public controversy. How do you do that? It's quite remarkable. To all the ministers who worked with me in the Cabinet at the time, thank you for your extraordinary contribution, the critical roles that you played. To the members of Parliament, past and present, and those of the Parliamentary Labor Party who honoured me by voting for me on 3 occasions to be your leader. I thank also the Australian people for the confidence they placed in me. I thank my former and current staff who, as I said before, have become members of our extended family. I thank Therese, my wife of 42 years. That deserves a long service medal. Who had the audacity to... who had the audacity to say to me as a young kid at the Australian National University, nearly half a century ago, when we first met in orientation week at Bergman College, myself at the vastly mature age of 18, Therese 17, when she said, "You should be in the Parliament." That was a long time ago. So it's both PJK and Therese who you have to blame for what's happened since. Darling, thank you for your encouragement and support. To our 3 fantastic kids, to Jess and to Marcus and Nick, who's not with us today, thank you so much for the unqualified love you've extended to your dad. It's a hard thing being the kid of a Prime Minister. It's a really hard thing. It's even a hard thing being the kid of a former Prime Minister. Also a hard thing. And to our 3 wonderful grandchildren for being such sources of joy for Therese and myself, to Josie and to Mackie and to baby Scarlett, who's back in Brisbane. Thank you for being the lights of our lives. You give us hope and cause for the future. And finally, I thank Philip Bacon. Philip for co-commissioning this portrait with Ralph, the artist, and Ralph for you applying your craft to render your subject with considerable sensitivity and a lot of kindness, most of it, much of it, perhaps all of it, undeserved. I thank you one and all.
Well, thanks very much. I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting. I pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and I am proud to lead a government that will give every Australian the opportunity to vote for constitutional recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in our founding document in a referendum later this year. I welcome Therese and Jess and Marcus and all the members of the Rudd family who are with us today. None of us in public life could serve without our families, and you have been a source of strength and inspiration to Kevin for longer than anyone else. Now, to Jess and Marcus, of course, you have something that Therese doesn't have because she knew what she was getting into. You were born into it, and our kids do, I think, have a focus as conscripts, which can make life difficult from time to time. So thank you for your contribution. It's great that your grandkids are here as well, or at least 2 out of the 3. Welcome. To all the parliamentary colleagues who are here, current and past. It is so fantastic looking out here. You can draw a crowd, Kev, let me tell you. It is an extraordinary turn-up here today, and that says a lot about the standing in which you are held and the respect that you have. To our friends from the United States of America, there's an Australian-American leadership dialogue function going on over the next couple of days here. I look forward to hosting you at the Lodge in a few hours' time, and you are very welcome guests here in this country. And of course, Ambassador Kennedy is doing a remarkable job. To all of Kevin's former staff and friends who are here as well, it is fantastic to see you and to see, as I have over a long period of time, the long loyalty. And Kevin spoke about members of the family. I regard that as someone who has a very small family in terms of blood relatives. Our staff do become our family and the rock on which we rely, both in the good times, but importantly as well in the difficult times going through, and it is fantastic to see so many who are here. I do want to give a shout out to our artist, Ralph Hymans, who is with us here today. Congratulations on 2 outstanding achievements. Now, I have to also sign off and approve the works, so I have had the preview, and it is indeed a really powerful portrait that I think really captures Kevin, and it's probably, without giving away too much, it's probably the only portrait to feature a pet. When you see what is about to happen coming up, and that's certainly, I just want to give you the teaser there. You're all thinking now what sort of pet is in this portrait, and it is indeed an outstanding achievement. But to you, Ralph, I also want to congratulate you on your second achievement, which is, how on earth did you persuade Kevin Rudd to sit still for long enough to get this done? That's what struck me. When Kevin spoke with me about the time, and indeed a number of Prime Ministers who followed Kevin, at least 27 and 28, have already had their portraits hung here. It struck me that it was possible that you had done it over a period of a decade on the moments in which Kevin was sitting still. Kevin, I welcome you here today, and it is an extraordinary honour for me, as someone who served as Deputy Prime Minister to you a decade ago, to welcome you here as Prime Minister today. I welcome you here as well as a very dear friend and comrade of such long-standing value and friendship. It is one where you have been a source of advice and a very good friend for a long period of time. But I also welcome you here, and you did make passing reference to it, as someone who gave this magnificent Parliament one of the finest moments I believe it's had since Federation, and without question, the finest moment that I have had as a Member of Parliament, in the first day in which I had the honour of being the Leader of the House of Representatives, the first day that Parliament sat in 2008. That apology was spoken about for a long period of time. It was said that it would result in division, that it would result in reparations, that it would be a moment of division. Instead, what it was a moment of national unity. And I pay tribute as well at this point in time to the courage and leadership of Brendan Nelson, at the time the leader of the Liberal Party, who showed leadership at that time as well. It was a moment in which anyone who was there will recall looking up at the galleries and seeing those Indigenous Australians like Lewidra O'Donoghue and so many others who had been through trauma and hardship of which I just cannot comprehend the enormity of what they had been through. And yet you had patiently sat down with the stolen generation, not just that day, over days and weeks and months following the 2007 election, gone to them and sat down about what they needed, about what they wanted. And you agonised over the words up until the point of causing me some angst that Parliament was not going to sit because you were still rewriting the words, because for you it was so important that it be pitch perfect. And indeed it was. Every word, perfect. Leaping out from the page as a demonstration of compassion and reconciliation and a verbal hug in the way that you embraced people who needed it. A beautiful piece of works, I believe, only matched by the beauty of that one-page Uluru Statement from the Heart in 2017. We have unfinished business, but you made a contribution which can never be taken away and can never be diminished. At that moment, whether it be Indigenous Australians in the gallery or whether it was school students gathered at every school in the nation watching it on big screens, or the people out there on the lawns cheering, the country stopped. And when the words finished, the country was larger. That moment of healing and unity was made possible because of the bravery and understanding of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. But it was also made possible because of Kevin's compassion, decency and leadership. It's the way that your government began and it's the way that it continued. Ratifying the Kyoto Protocol on the very day that the government was sworn in. The largest ever increase in history to the age pension and Australia's first paid parental leave scheme. Record investments in social and affordable housing. The abolition of work choices. The creation of the National Broadband Network as part of a significant rollout of infrastructure, including more funding for urban public transport than all previous governments combined in the previous 107 years since Federation. And the world's best response, bar none, to the global financial crisis. A set of policies which meant that while every other advanced economy was falling into recession, the Australian economy actually grew. It was indeed a very challenging time to serve as Prime Minister, but I think also it was a time in which leadership was required and leadership was shown. And the final thing that I want to say this morning about Kevin, and it's a quality captured so well, I think, in the work that we are about to unveil, is that he has always been someone who has shown a belief in Australia's capacity to show international leadership as well. Not seeing us as a small country, an island continent far away, but an active and constructive Indo-Pacific power that could punch above our weight in the world because of who we are. Our capacity as one of the great multicultural success stories in the world to use that to project our values to the world. Australia acting as both architect and advocate for peace and security, for economic and environmental progress. As Kevin once said, a principle encompassing not only what Australia can do for itself, but also what Australia can do for the world. And I saw that firsthand at the first meeting of the G20 in London. Over those days there that I had the privilege, along with Kevin and Treasurer Wayne Swan, of attending, it was a time where the world was on an abyss, at the edge of a cliff, where it needed global cohesive action to avoid that cliff. And I say this as a source of Australian pride. There was no person more important in that room than the leader of what's now, and I think then, the 12th largest economy in the world, Kevin Rudd. He was the person who I saw physically, verbally, was engaging between Asian powers, including China, and European and North American powers, of course led by our friends in the United States of America. And that difference that I saw firsthand at that meeting is something that showed his extraordinary strategic and intellectual tenacity as he brought together people to coordinate a response to the global financial crisis. That same spirit saw Kevin launch Australia's successful bid for a seat on the UN Security Council. And of course, what we know is that Kevin's faith in Australia hasn't faded. Neither has his belief in service to our nation. And that's why, given Kevin's capacity in the service that he'd done to the Asia Society, his book about the relationship between China and the United States, that should be compulsory reading for anyone who wants to understand the strategic tensions but also opportunities in our region, is so important. And that's what led Penny Wong and I to ask Kevin to accept the role of our ambassador to the United States of America, where he is doing such an outstanding job representing Australia. So I say to Kevin, we are grateful for all of your service to Australia. We are grateful that your service continues, and you can be proud that everyone who visits this building, including future generations, will be able to look at this portrait and know your place in our nation's history.